Happy to be here, David, and happy to be here with your folks on a Tuesday afternoon talking about Anna Rosenberg and my new book, The Confidant. Here we have a photo of Anna. As David said, she was a Jewish Hungarian girl from Budapest. Here we have her with her family. You can tell by the photograph, prominent. They were a comfortable family, and there's a story about that later on at the end, which I'll share with you. The man with the cap to the right is her father, Albert Lederer. So she was Anna Lederer. That was her birth name. Albert Lederer provided furnishings for the Austro-Hungarian emperor. And his part of his job was to go out and scour Europe and, get the Louis XIV furnishings from around the fancy houses and bring them back to the palaces of the emperor and install them. And on one of these jobs in about 1908 or 1909, he went around Europe at his own expense, his own time. He collected the furnishings that had been ordered by the emperor, and he showed up at the palace for the installation, and the emperor broke the contract and said, no, we're not doing that anymore. So sorry about that. Albert Lederer, almost in an instant, was financially ruined. He had incurred tremendous costs for this project, and because of a caprice of an emperor, he was financially done for. He was so badly financially hurt that he decided to leave the country and without his family at first, and to sail for New York, where in 1910, he arrived in New York, and like so many thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of others, started life anew in the needle trades in Lower Manhattan. And it took Albert Lederer 2 years before he could summon for his 2 daughters and his wife back in Hungary. But in those 2 years, Albert Lederer became a fiercely patriotic American. He was the kind of person that would, tears would flow when he saw the fluttering flag. He would recite the Pledge of Allegiance. He would, the idea of voting, the idea even of jury duty was something that he was very fond of. And he was, of course, applying for citizenship at this time. So these are ideals that he is going to instill in his daughter, Anna, upon her arrival in 1912. And David, if you could move up one slide. Here we have Anna looking straight at us and her sister, Clara. They arrived in 1912 with their mother, a wonderful reunion for the family. And when they were at Ellis Island, they were sort of processed, and their mother, her name was anglicized from from Sarolta to Charlotte, and Clara, they wanted her to be Claire. And when they got to Anna, they said, Anna, how would you like to be Anne? And Anna said, no, thank you. I will be Anna. So she was headstrong even from a very early age. We'll go ahead and skip up one slide. In these years, 1912 to 1913-14, up through America's entry into World War I, there were 2 things that young Anna Lederer found herself just inflamed by. And one of them was, of course, women's suffrage. In these years, her first 5 years in the United States, 1912 to 1917, 1918, women's suffrage was a topic. There were marches in the streets of New York, numbering in the tens of thousands of women. It was something that was in the water supply. It was in the air. It was something that they could almost taste. And young Anna Rosenberg, teenage Anna Lederer rather, marched in these marches, listened to speakers speak on women's suffrage, and did what she could, even as a teenager, to help women get across that line. The other very important thing that was happening, of course, this time, 1917, is the United States entry into World War I. And once again, Anna, who had been taught by her father that, this country is so different than the empire that sort of kicked us out. This is a place where your voice can be heard, your actions can be felt. So she wanted to do something for her adopted country. She sold Liberty bonds. I did the math in the book. Young Anna Lederer sold something in the neighborhood of over $100,000 worth of Liberty bonds. And of course, here she and her sister are volunteering as Red Cross nurses. When Anna Rosenberg was later interviewed by the great journalist Edward R. Murrow, she talked about how her father would take the 2 sisters to the Statue of Liberty just time and time again. They sort of saw that as a a talisman or a symbol, of course, of American freedom. And that was something that she never forgot in her long life. We could skip ahead one slide. When Anna Lederer had finished high school or had left high school, I should say, she married a veteran, a World War I veteran, a man named Mike Rosenberg, and the two of them started a life together. In 1920, they had a son, Thomas, and Anna, of course, was casting about for what to do as a career. And it was at this moment when she was in her 20s, early 20s, where she met two very formative people in her early life. One was a name that many of you will recognize, Belle Moskowitz, who was the de facto chief of staff of the governor of New York, Al Smith. She was a woman at that time with uncommon power, all of it behind the curtain. You know, she was writing legislation. She was fundraising for the governor. She was doing all the things that a chief of staff would do for a politician who had national aspirations. And Anna came to work for her. They were raising money for Jewish philanthropies and organizing events. And Belle Moskowitz saw in Anna, now Rosenberg, not only could she speak German as well because of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Belle Moskowitz spoke German, but she had an uncommon work ethic, and she could just get things done. After organizing an event for 3,000 people, Belle Moskowitz sent Anna a check, a sizable check. We don't know exactly the amount. Anna sent it back, thinking that she was just sort of being taken under Belle Moskowitz's wing as sort of an intern. Ms. Moskowitz sent the check back with a note that said, Anna, if you don't value your own work, no one else will. And she also suggested, because of her talents, that Anna consider opening a public relations, labor relations firm, because even as a youngster, she had a gift for mediating. In fact, going back to high school just for 1 second, she found herself in the New York Times for the first time as a teenager for successfully mediating the end of a student strike that was around compulsory military training for the boys after school. So she was a born mediator, Anna Rosenberg was. The other person that she met at this time in the 20s that was formative was an old Tammany Hall district leader named Jim Hagan. You know, you can just picture this guy. Yeah, you know, the cigar smoke, the spittoons on the floor. This guy was, you know, a bare-knuckled brawler, and he'd been the district leader for 3 decades. Well, Anna met him when he was giving a speech against women's suffrage. And Anna and her friends from high school, who were all, of course, pro-suffrage, went into this meeting to hear this man speak. And during the speech, Anna could take no more, and she rose from the back of the hall and sassed this guy, which was just unheard of. And the room, of course, fell silent. Instead of getting angry, though, Jim Hagan invited her up at the end of the event to meet this woman, this young woman. And he became her mentor for the next 3 years, teaching her retail politics of New York, how many phone calls, how many dozens, hundreds, thousands of phone calls to make, how to hit the pavement to get your issue acted upon and to get your person elected. In this photo, we see Anna over on the right-hand side. The women that she's talking to are unidentified. It's very interesting, though, that they're all women. And the name in the upper right is one of the, because of Jim Hagan and Belle Moskowitz, their guidance for her as a woman in her 20s, Anna Rosenberg became one of the first women to manage political campaigns in American history. And they weren't just state campaigns. They weren't just alderman campaigns. Here's one for U.S. Congress, a man named Theodore Pizer, who won his seat thanks in part to Anna's management. We don't know what was said here, of course, at this conversation between Anna and these women, but I like to think it was, you know, ladies, we can get out there and get our voices heard. We can get our priorities baked into law, and let's go out and do this now that we have the right to vote. Thank you. We'll skip on to one further slide. Still in her 20s at this point, Anna Rosenberg is 28 years old. She has a 8-year-old son. She is, of course, married. She is making a name for herself for her mediation business and her labor relations business. She's gaining clients. She's becoming a woman that one media outlet calls her the busiest woman of New York, because she's not only a married woman with a son, a businesswoman who is sort of bringing in perhaps even more money than her husband, which was uncommon for the time. But Anna Rosenberg always made time for politics. And she later said she was a housewife dabbling in politics, but she was much more than that. Not only was she one of the first women to manage political campaigns, but in 1928, she made a connection that really changed the trajectory of her life. In 1928, Anna Rosenberg went to a Democratic tea hosted by Eleanor Roosevelt, who, of course, is on the right of this picture. This is, of course, much later, 1940s. But Eleanor Roosevelt was giving this event, and she met this young woman. She said, young lady, what do you do for a living? And Anna said, well, I have a mediation office, a public relations and labor relations firm that I've started. And Eleanor Roosevelt said, well, I would like you to meet my husband because he's running for governor of New York and he could use someone like that on his team. So at age 28, Anna Rosenberg found herself on the Roosevelt gubernatorial team with people like Louis Howe and Jim Farley and the great Francis Perkins. Now, of course, when Franklin Roosevelt was governor of New York, he was only there for 10 months when the curtain of the Great Depression descended upon the state and the country. And unlike almost any other politician in the country, Franklin Roosevelt, of course, put together an energetic, and his advisors put together an energetic response to the Great Depression that included provisions for getting people back to work. It included provisions for hydroelectric power and the like. And these and reforestation and a whole host of things that would later be scaled up at the national level. In 1932, Roosevelt had positioned himself as the leading contender for the Democratic nomination, of course, and he was elected by a wide margin in that year. And the things that he had pioneered in New York State, he scaled up as the New Deal. And when he scaled that up as the New Deal, he called upon Anna Rosenberg again to be the chief executive of not one, but two massive New Deal programs. And remember, this is Roosevelt's home state, and there's a lot riding on this stuff working. You know, in 1933, 34, things were very dodgy, as I'm sure many of you know, and our democracy, United States democracy, could have gone the way of Germany or Italy. And it was certainly not a foregone conclusion that we would get out of that. Roosevelt made Anna Rosenberg the executive of the National Industrial Recovery Act in New York. But in 1935, the Supreme Court put an end to that program with its controversial decision, the so-called sick chicken case, which was roundly criticized by legal scholars and indeed by the president and the mayor of New York, Fiorello LaGuardia, who was, by the way, a very close friend of Anna Rosenberg, and they in fact drove to work together in the mayor's limousine. After the end of the National Industrial Recovery Act, though, Roosevelt made Anna Rosenberg the chief executive of the Social Security program in the state of New York, where she, who had never gone to college, let alone law school, had hundreds of lawyers working for her. She had dozens of field offices, and she signed up 6 million New Yorkers to Social Security. And she would have, older women say to her, I can't give you my real age because my husband doesn't know my real age. And Anna would say, well, Uncle Sam and I will keep your secrets. Before we move on from the New Deal, though, I would like to share a little story. In 1938, Anna, you can see from this picture, is wearing a very elaborate hat. This was something that was a trademark of hers. She was very fond of these very elaborate, very fancy hats, and she had dozens of them to choose from. Well, Franklin Roosevelt liked to tease her about these hats. In 1938, Anna was paying a visit to Washington as part of the Social Security. The 12 regional directors were all there, and she was, of course, one of them. And Franklin Roosevelt rolled in and said to Anna, Anna, that's a very interesting hat you're wearing today, but I can't tell if you're coming or going. And Anna said, well, Mr. President, that's because it's a New Deal hat. David, we'll move on. As World War loomed over the horizon, these are the years 1939, 40, 41. Europe already plunged into war, and the United States entry seeming to get closer by the day. Franklin Roosevelt once again relied on Anna Rosenberg, who was, during the New Deal, she was mostly based in New York at her Social Security office. But by World War II, she was splitting time about 50-50 between Washington and New York City. And in fact, the president gave her an office in the East Wing. Now, she was becoming something of a fixer is a pejorative term, so I won't use that, but Franklin Roosevelt called her his Mrs. Fix-It. She was somebody who, he couldn't trust to just go out and get stuff done without causing a lot of fanfare. And she would, of course, do it by the book. She wasn't trying to cut corners at all. But I'll give you a few examples of what she did for the president and for the country during World War II. First thing that Roosevelt needed her to do had to do with the fact that the defense industries were cranking up by the summer of 1941. This is only 6 months before Pearl Harbor. These were good paying jobs for people who had been, buffeted by the Depression, and they were only being given to white Americans. So A. Philip Randolph, the black leader of the day, told the White House that he was going to have a march for equality in Washington, D.C. And when President Roosevelt said, well, Mr. Randolph, how many marchers do you think you'll have? He said 100,000. Now, even Eleanor Roosevelt was in favor of this, but Franklin Roosevelt was not, because he was very afraid that this could lead to violence. Washington, D.C. at the time had a Southern mentality, and the idea of thousands of black marchers and a sort of a white police force, New York City, Washington police force could have been a powder keg. And we certainly didn't want to show our caste system to the world at the very moment that we wanted to show unity and democracy. So he asked Anna, he said, go down to New York, get with the missus, meaning Eleanor, and go interface with A. Philip Randolph and Walter White of the NAACP and get this march stopped. She was unable to do so. Randolph and Walter White wanted a face-to-face meeting with the president, or they were marching. So over 2 weeks in the summer of 1941, Roosevelt and Anna, Roosevelt had Anna attend meetings over 2 weeks that summer, both in Washington and New York, to try and mediate a solution to this impasse. And finally, it all came down to a showdown at the White House. And of course, Anna Rosenberg was there, as was Fiorello LaGuardia and the two black leaders, and of course, the president. The meeting wasn't going very well until Fiorello LaGuardia said, well, why don't we all take a break and see what we can hammer out? And the president said, this is a good idea. Anna, take Walter White and A. Philip Randolph, go into the cabinet room, see if you can come up with a deal that will be acceptable to both parties. And she did. What she drafted became Executive Order 8802, which mandated fairness in defense hiring and was called by David Kennedy one of the most significant, or the most significant, federal action on civil rights since Reconstruction. But she still had to get the document signed by the president. And here, Eleanor got back in the game and said, Anna, now what I'd like you to do is go down to those boutiques of Georgetown, buy yourself one of those fancy new hats that you love, get yourself the confidence, come back and get the president to sign it. That's exactly what she did. She went down, she bought herself a new hat. She brought the draft executive order out of her handbag. She spread it on the president's desk and said, sign it, Mr. President, sign it. And he listened, he did. And that became a transformative federal action on civil rights. We'll move on to one other slide. I'll pause here just for a second. As David mentioned at the outset, questions are welcome. I'm a high school history teacher. I like questions. This is about my 50th event, either in person or Zoom, regarding the Confidante. So I'm used to these questions, but I would urge you, if you have questions, to throw it in the chat. And David will, at the end, or the last third of our talk, we'll get to those questions. Here we have another photo. This is from the early 40s. The other issue that was bedeviling the Roosevelt administration, we're now 1942 and 43, was what was going on with the arsenal of democracy. Now we think, the president just flipped the switch and all of a sudden the Chrysler factories were cranking out tanks and everything was working well. It wasn't like that. There was a real labor issue. There were way too many workers in New York City. There were too few workers in places like Portland, Oregon. Contracts were being defaulted upon. And if these contracts are defaulted upon, it really, lives are at risk overseas in the battlefields of in the high seas of World War II. One of the worst hit locations where contracts were imperiled was Buffalo, New York. They built everything in Buffalo: tanks, jeeps, parachutes, medicine, ordnance for the Allies, aircraft for the Allies, aircraft for the United States, just everything. And they were short almost 100,000 workers. Roosevelt had Mrs. Fix-It go up to Buffalo, installed her as the labor czar of that city, and she immediately got to work. They needed women. She knew this, not just single women, but married women with children. And those women would need childcare, and they would need a place to cash their check at 3 a.m. when their shift was done. So Anna Rosenberg does all the logistics. She gets, thousands and thousands of women to sign on. She urges transparency so they know what they're building, not just that they're going to work at 2 a.m. And she not only gets women to sign on to get on board, she promises you'll get more social equality if you do this, but she gets Black Americans as well. And when the leaders of Buffalo and the unions of Buffalo were dismayed by that, she sat them down and she said, this is no time for disunity. You need to get on board with this program. And they did. And not only during World War II, but for Black Americans in Buffalo, many of them were able to keep these jobs well into the late 40s, early 50s. These were good paying jobs at large defense companies. Not only did women and Black Americans help out in Buffalo, but Americans with disabilities and even high schoolers after school would pitch in. And the almost 100,000 workers were there thanks to Anna, and the contracts were satisfied. And Time magazine called it the Rosenberg Plan. Other magazines came to call it the Buffalo Plan. But if you go back and read American magazines, Life, Time, Newsweek, and other Saturday Evening Post from the early 1940s, the Buffalo Plan was huge because it allowed the arsenal of democracy to fire on all cylinders. I'll read for you what exactly, this is just a page from the book, what this effect was, what the Rosenberg Plan did for the arsenal of democracy. There were these things called Liberty ships. In fact, this picture here that you're looking at, Anna is christening, or I guess the word is sponsoring a ship that would later serve in the Battle of Okinawa, wearing one of her trademark hats. But going back to 1941, they had these ships called Liberty ships. They were huge cargo vessels that transported material across the Atlantic to the battle zone. The first Liberty ship was called the Star of Oregon. It was launched on September 27th, 1941. Construction took 131 days. After Anna Rosenberg got the Buffalo Plan to be rolled out nationwide so that workers were placed where they were most needed, for instance, New York, tens of thousands of New Yorkers went out to work at the shipyards out west. After that happened, the keel of the Robert E. Perry was laid on a Sunday. It set sail 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes afterwards. And a woman was there to sponsor the ship, but she was late. One of the dock workers yelled, "Just keep standing there, ma'am. There'll be another one along in a minute." David, we'll move on to the next slide. You can see Anna Rosenberg is very fond of hats. We'll move on one more slide. In 1944, President Roosevelt took the really extraordinary step of ordering Anna Rosenberg over to Europe. This is only weeks after D-Day, to act as his personal representative in the European theater. Her mission was going to take place over about 6 weeks. Her mission was to find out from the GIs themselves what they dreamed for, what they hoped for when they returned back, if they were lucky to return back to the United States. And so in the fall of 1944, Anna Rosenberg finds herself in France, in Nazi-occupied France, and she was the same circumstances as the soldiers. In other words, they were pinned down in Normandy for a good amount of time, and then were only able to break through a little bit later. But she saw what the men saw: dead Americans, dead enemy, ruined villages, widows and orphans, the toll of war. She saw all of those things. And, she knew these men, when they returned, they would be different people than when they left. But over those 6 weeks, she traveled with them as one of them, eating rations off the hood of a Jeep, listening to them talk about their sweethearts as they pulled pictures out of their helmets, and writing down in her dozens of notebooks what they wanted from the United States when they returned. And what they wanted surprised her and later surprised President Roosevelt, because what they wanted was a college education. These men didn't want to learn how to operate a new machine necessarily. They certainly wanted a job when they got home. But what they really wanted, what they dreamed of, was having an opportunity to better themselves through higher education, opportunity which had been foreclosed to them prior to this time in American history. You know, they were the generation of the Depression and war. A college education was something only for wealthy young men. And for these 10 million, 12 million GIs, they wanted that college education, an opportunity to have a piece of the America they were trying to help save. And when Anna told this to President Roosevelt, she said he lit up, huge smile on his face, and said, that's what we have to do. And if you look at what happened to the GI Bill, or the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, if you look at what happened to that in 45, 46, 47, it was almost entirely educational and thrust. And by 47, the New York Times is saying that NYU is like half GIs. And this is transformative for modern America because millions of Americans were able to enter the middle class. David, we'll move on. On her 2 trips to the battlefield of Europe, she made another one late in the war in April and May of 1945. But on both trips, of course, she made time to visit wounded soldiers. The trip in 1945 was ordered by Roosevelt, but Roosevelt died before she got on the plane or the ship. So President Truman sent her to Europe, and she was supposed to do the same thing, follow up with the GIs so we can shape the GI Bill as it went forward. But in that time, of course, the Soviets and the Americans had discovered and liberated the first concentration camps. And General Eisenhower cabled Washington immediately and said, I want witnesses, I want journalists, I want Congress people, I want people here to see this and to bear witness to this. And of course, Anna Rosenberg was already in Europe, already in the battlefield or battle zone. So she was flown to the Nordhausen camp, where she became one of the first Allied women to see a camp that had been liberated. She was there so soon after liberation that the prisoners were still wearing their uniforms. And she said few could stand erect. These women would barely able to walk, came up to her. And of course, Anna was wearing what she always wore on these trips, which was a WAC uniform with a pair of boots. She always carried a woman's handbag, a purse, and she always carried a man's briefcase. So these women approach Anna, and Anna realizes she doesn't have any clothes, she doesn't have any food. What can I give these poor women? And she reached in and she, out of her purse, and gave lipsticks and a compact, and out of the briefcase, pencils and a note paper. And she talked about the insufficiency of this gesture very movingly later. She only talked about it once that I could find, but she also said that, the look on these women's faces was, I've been given back part of my personhood, all of which had been taken from me. So even the gesture was insufficient. It actually, helped get these prisoners back on the road to their humanity. So we'll move on to another slide. She was not a VIP on these 2 trips to Europe. She at one point was pinned down by sniper fire. She was in the forward zones. Move on one other slide. David, we'll keep going. One other. Here's a picture of her with a very famous general. Many of you will recognize him. We'll go back a slide. This is General Patton. General Patton, a very tough, hard-nosed soldier. She called him Georgie. They were very fond of each other. But when Anna arrived at his forward post, his dog bit her on the backside. We'll move up one slide. After World War II, in October of 1945, Anna Rosenberg and David, this is something that I think I did jump on Wiki and make and reflect this accurately. In 1945, Anna Rosenberg became the first man or woman ever in American history to be awarded the Medal of Freedom, which we now know as the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Back then in 1945, it was limited to civilians who helped defeat the enemy in World War II, and she was the first recipient of that high civilian award. You can see the pride on her face in that photograph. We'll go forward one slide. When I was interviewing her son, Thomas, for the book, The Confidant, he said something that really struck me. He said, so few times in history, there's not many people that have been the confidant of one great leader and also been a close advisor or even a confidant to others. And it's true when you think about it. The confidant relationship is usually, one very powerful person and one confidant. But in Anna Rosenberg's case, her grandson said she not only could get into the halls of power, but she had the social graces to stay there. And I would add the work ethic. And I would also add she kept confidences. So here she is with President Truman in the booklet that he has, the report that he is holding. It was one of the things that gave him the ammunition to desegregate the armed forces. He knew he didn't have congressional votes for it, so he had to take the courageous act of doing it by executive order, but he wanted to know if it made sense from a military standpoint, and Anna Rosenberg, of course, helped prepare a report that said it did. Integrated troops are going to fight better and be better for the security of the nation. We'll move on. Here's a very classic picture of Anna Rosenberg in her natural habitat. You can see 2 phones on her desk, but there are photos that have 3. And there is actually a lot of newspaper articles and magazine articles that talk about her having 3 phones at a time. This is part of why her impact on the war and the post-war was evaporated from history or dissipated from history. Was she said herself, I leave no memos. I don't draft things with 8 carbons. I am a person that talks on the telephone a lot. I pick up the phone. I say, can you get this done? And the deal is done. So there wasn't a great paper trail for her. And part of that was by her own practices of being sort of a person that uses the telephone to cut through red tape. We'll move on one. I love this quote. I found it rather late in my research, but boy, I just love it. You can take a minute to read it. I think we would agree it's a message for all citizens. David, we'll move on. Anna Rosenberg's extraordinary career really is one of 2 acts. And the first act was, of course, the Roosevelt Act, the busiest woman in New York at age 28 who finds herself in the Roosevelt orbit. And by the end of the war, she was considered one of the closest advisors to the president. The Chicago Tribune said, with the exception of Harry Hopkins, she might have been the closest person to the president during World War II. And that's not hyperbole. General Walter Bedell Smith said essentially the same thing. And the president's own calendar shows Anna meeting with him something in the neighborhood of 130 times one-on-one, which was more access than most of the Roosevelt cabinet. But Act 2 was even more incredible, because in 1950, Anna Rosenberg was back in New York trying to rebuild her business, rebuild her finances, finally buy that condominium, that apartment that she'd rented for decades. Her son was going to work with her at the PR firm, and things were going to be great. And she got a letter from the Secretary of Defense, the man on the right, George Marshall, saying to her in the beginning of the letter, "Dear Anna, I hope you'll see your way clear to come down to Washington again, because I need an assistant Secretary of Defense to work with me to rebuild the size and strength of the U.S. Army as we try to occupy Germany and Japan and hem in the Soviets in Eastern Europe, and also fighting this disastrous war in Korea." And so the decision was made to nominate Anna Rosenberg to be the Assistant Secretary of Defense, a civilian woman, a former New Dealer. She was Jewish. She spoke with an accent, and she knew all of those. She knew that she had the bullseye. And she said to Marshall and to President Truman, "I don't want to be your Dreyfus affair," referring to the case of anti-Semitism from 1890s France. And it speaks to how much they wanted her, that Marshall and Truman stood up for her as the haters came out of the woodwork. There was a radio star named Fulton Lewis, who, to his 10 million listeners, made anti-Semitic remarks and denigrated her as just a little social worker, and said she was going to be the dictator of the Pentagon. And then, of course, Fulton Lewis was was joined by Senator Joe McCarthy. And before Anna Rosenberg could be fully, could take her position, she had to have the full Senate vote on her. So what McCarthy did was, after the Senate Armed Services Committee had voted to approve her nomination, McCarthy pulled some strings with some allies and bought himself about 2 weeks to conjure up a smear campaign. McCarthy found a guy in New York who would come down to Washington and testify that Anna Rosenberg had been a communist in 1930. Now, or the 1930s. Over 2 weeks in December of 1950, this riveted the nation. It riveted Washington, D.C. It was on there was a radio war between guys like Fulton Lewis on the one side and Edward Murrow on the other side. And it was a character assassination that Murrow said missed, because the man they'd found in New York, he was a liar. He was somebody who his story unraveled quickly under questioning from people like Senator Lyndon Johnson and others, and Senator William Benton and others. And finally, his testimony just evaporated. And it helped that Anna Rosenberg had a New York City phone book, and she held it up and she said, "How many Anna Rosenbergs are in this phone book?" 47. And lo and behold, they found the communist Anna Rosenberg living out in California. The Anna Rosenberg you're looking at right now was a lifelong anti-communist and a lifelong patriotic American. One of the only women to defeat McCarthy in his 4 or 5 year reign of terror. So many careers ended prematurely, but not Anna Rosenberg. He tangled with Anna Rosenberg, and he was worse for the wear. We'll move on one slide. As Assistant Secretary of Defense for 26 months during the Korean War, Anna Rosenberg made 2 trips to the battlefield. And once again, she looked in the footlocker. She lifted up the pot on the soup. She lifted up the lid on the soup pot. She looked at the quality of the boots and the socks and made sure that the men were well cared for, and they loved her for it. She reduced the number of points they needed, so not hardly anybody spent 2 winters in Korea. And she did more to raise combat pay than anyone had done previously. We'll keep moving. Move down one more slide. Here we see her kneeling in the dirt with some integrated troops. We can go back one. Beg your pardon. Here we see her kneeling in the dirt with some integrated troops when she did much as Assistant Secretary of Defense to see that not only the combat units were integrated, but the schools on the bases down south were integrated, and they were before Brown versus Board of Education. The military schools, thanks to Anna Rosenberg, were fully integrated by the end of 1953. When she arrived in Korea for the first visit, a journalist said, "Mrs. Rosenberg, how many Black soldiers are serving in Korea?" And she said, "That's not the question. How many American soldiers are serving in Korea?" We'll keep moving. And go ahead and go one past this. And go ahead and go one past that, if you would, to this one with the sergeant. I love this photograph, and reading the letters between the soldiers and Anna Rosenberg was one of the real treats of doing the research. They thought the world of her. She was a true champion of the soldier and their families. And they would send her letters and Valentine's cards and little gifts. And it was great. One unit named her Miss Wolfhound 1952. Anna Rosenberg had beaten out Doris Day and Marilyn Monroe. We'll keep moving. I think many of you, if not all of you, will recognize the man on the right. That's Lyndon Johnson. Here he's a senator. His job on the Senate Armed Services Committee is to make sure that the budget is kept in check. He's trying to give Anna Rosenberg the Johnson treatment, which he so often did to get his way. But as you can see, Anna Rosenberg is having none of it. She's eyeball to eyeball because her job is to do what she can on behalf of the GIs and their families. Now, these two might be in an adversarial position in this photograph, but they were tremendous friends, going all the way back to the late 1930s when Lyndon Johnson was a young congressman. In fact, great story. On the eve of his special election, he was a little bit shy of money, and Anna Rosenberg sent a $500 campaign check to the campaign. He never forgot that, not even after he was the president of the United States. We'll keep moving. There was one president, however, that of Eisenhower and Truman and Roosevelt and Johnson, there was one president that did not use Anna Rosenberg's talents to her full capacity, and that was, of course, John F. Kennedy, who saw her more or less as a fundraiser. And of course, Eleanor Roosevelt said, to Kennedy, here's a great person to have on your cabinet, a woman on your cabinet, which is what you should have. And it was not to be. Not only was Anna not put on the cabinet, but no women, virtually no women in the Kennedy administration had any role of significant power. But Anna, as a loyal Democrat and a loyal American, did what she could to raise funds for the Kennedy campaign. So if you go down one more slide, you'll see her sitting next to the president during the sort of controversial 1962 birthday gala, which of course is known for Marilyn Monroe being quite late and singing that breathy version of Happy Birthday to the President. If you look back, next time you look at the video footage of this, the woman sitting and standing next to President Kennedy for the duration of the evening is Anna Rosenberg. And if you'll skip up one, we see Marilyn Monroe at the after party, which also was attended by Anna Rosenberg and other luminaries. Sadly, Marilyn Monroe only lived about 2.5 months after this photograph was taken. And David, if you'll go up one last slide here, I guess there's two more. Here is Anna Rosenberg Hoffman. She was married for the second time in 1962. And the second marriage was more of a true love kind of marriage than the first one had been. This is the grandson that I interviewed for the book, Thomas. Here's just a baby. He had two really great stories. The book launch was about 3 months ago. He was over at Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge, Mass., and he was overcome with emotion. He was so proud. He loved his grandmother dearly, and he shared this wonderful story, which I'll share with you. He would play, when he was in boarding school as a teenager, he would visit his grandmother, who had a home in Katona, New York, with her second husband, Paul Hoffman, and they would play bridge. Thomas, the grandson, would team up with his father, also named Thomas, and they would be one team. And Anna would team up with her sister, Claire, and Claire and Anna would be the other team. And the bridge game would be going along just fine until the two sisters started to speak in Hungarian. I've talked a lot about, I've talked for a good long, better part of an hour, so I want to save some time for some questions. I know you have some. I see some in the chat, and I'm sure David can moderate some. So if that's okay with everybody.
That's great. Perfect. Yeah. So we don't have a lot of time, but I mean, I was speaking personally mesmerized by, an absolutely astounding story about an astounding heroic individual. I'm quite confident that many of our viewers will have a question about her Jewish identity. You spoke about anti-Semitism in her engagement with the Second War, but you didn't say anything beyond that. What do we know about her Jewish identity?
We know that from her father, Albert Lederer, there was and this is not uncommon, as many of your folks will recognize. There was an idea that they should assimilate, and they should Albert Lederer, her father, that they should maybe tamp down their Jewish identity as a way to Americanize. These are the early decades of the 20th century, and she became a non-observant. She was non-observant. I found personally no evidence that she went to temple. It's kind of dumb, but she had a Christmas tree. She seemed to have, gifted, exchanged Christmas gifts. That said, I've run into two people on the book tour so far. One rabbi, in fact, said she had gone to the first check he ever got in life was written by Anna Rosenberg Hoffman. He'd stuffed some envelopes for her, and she attended his bar mitzvah. And in fact, that story happened twice. There were two older gents that shared that story. So religious practices, she was not observant. After World War II, she was asked to spearhead the relief efforts from New York, really from the Eastern Seaboard, but based in New York, to the Jewish refugees of Europe. which she did, and she did that with she was all in. Literally millions of tons of stuff was going out. Tinned foods, bolts of cloth, soap, money, dried powdered milk. I mean, the works. So she took that job very seriously, and that was that was something she was asked by fellow Jews to do this, and she did it, and she did it with her typical extraordinary effort.
Okay, and related to that, and we've also gotten several questions about this. She was on the inside of the FDR administration. She was there during the war. Do we have any record of any action, statements, attempted influence with respect to Jews and their plight during the Holocaust?
I did not come across any, and your folks are not going to be surprised. I frankly wasn't surprised either, because there's been scholarship, real scholars. I'm a high school history teacher, but there's been scholarship on Jewish advisors to Roosevelt. He liked to have Jewish advisors around him, even as a governor of New York. People like Henry Morgenthau and Felix Frankfurter, David Niles, and others. But the scholars that I've looked at that have tried to figure out what conversations were being had at the White House about what was happening in Europe are pretty unsatisfactory. I mean, we know the ship to St. Louis was turned back, and the Roosevelt administration seems to have, painting with the broad brush, but too little, too late. And this is with Jewish advisors around him, so it's a bit of a mystery why. Were these folks trying to gain access and keep access? Why did they feel like if they went a little bit harder on this issue, they'd be sort of shunned by Roosevelt, who could do that, who could be that person? The other thing that complicates Anna's story with him is she claims to have burned the letters that she exchanged with the president, involved in these almost 130 one-on-one meetings. And I was unable to find them. She told Diane Sawyer that she burned the letters with Roosevelt. So I found no evidence that she specifically said to the president, we need to do more about what is happening to the plight of Jews in Europe. But she would not have been the only Jewish advisor to be that person. There were others around his orbit that also were in that category.
So, I mean, you also, in the photo that you showed of her at her desk with the phones, made reference to the fact that she didn't create memos and the like. Do you suspect she just didn't want to leave a personal record if she was burning letters and she refused to put things in? We don't know her soul, do we?
We don't. The letters, I want to be clear, the letters that she claimed to have burned were actually these sort of chits that Roosevelt would have. And they could be doodles, they could be jokes, they could be, we don't know. There were, if you pick up the book, there are some rumors that the two of them, that he was very flirty with her. I don't think it went further than flirtation, but she did decide to burn those letters. She was not interested in a memoir. Eleanor Roosevelt said, I'm going to put you in charge with the biographer. I want you to talk to this guy. And she said quite clearly, no, I'm not going to do it. So, although she liked being in the magazines, of which she was in all of them in the 1940s and 50s. She liked to be interviewed in the New York Times for 7 decades. But David, it was never about her. It was always about the president or the GIs or the war effort or the women or the civil rights, but it was never about her. And that was something that she was consistent about through her life. She did not want to write a memoir. She found the me and FDR memoir industrial complex very distasteful. And she was first, last, and always somebody who wanted to keep the confidence. And, she's the confidant after all.
Wow. And she seems to have done a magnificent job of it. Well, just a fantastic story. I mean, it raises, as we listen to her public life and her involvement, it raises as many questions as it answers in terms of what was her soul behind this. It's very striking. And you didn't get this from interviews with her grandson or others she may have left afterward either. I mean, they didn't have anything to say about this?
Well, yeah, I will say one thing about her. Her soul. She was in both World War II and Korea. There's a dissertation out there that I cite in the book that talks about how the religion, I think they called it sort of the chaplaincy, or the religious officers over there in Korea saw in her somebody who was very, very concerned about the moral and religious health of the soldiers doing the fighting. So that, regardless of what religion they were, that was something that she got a lot of credit for by the chaplaincy office. In terms of soul, you know, she was somebody who was, I kept waiting for something, for her to do something that wasn't, you know, about expanding democracy, about expanding the franchise for women, for Black Americans. And that thing never came. She was so consistent about that from the time she was arrived in the United States through the 1920s, all the way through the end of her life. She saw this country at its best as one that expands the franchise for everybody. And we are all in this together, and we are the greatest country, or we're at our greatest if we're all have some skin in the game and have an opportunity to put some skin in the game. And that was the argument she was making to women and to Black Americans. And she was extraordinarily consistent with that.
Okay, so we're pushing the time limit, but we have to come back to the original question, which you touched on, but I don't think actually answered. So maybe in a sentence or two. So why didn't we know about her?
Didn't want to trumpet her own experiences or her own career, was fond of the telephone. And she also shared the unfortunate surname with the Rosenberg atomic spies at the same time. So that was another big reason. But more than anything, David and your folks listening, she felt that she'd been told these things in uttermost confidence by some of the great leaders of the 20th century. And she was not about to talk out of school. So she was the confidant, which if you'll indulge me for 1 second, I wish I had a copy of the book. I don't, but they're available everywhere books are sold, and Audible, Kindle, and also, of course, the hard copy. So some of these questions that I'm sure you have will be answered in the book.
Okay, great. You all know how to obtain books these days, right? We're all involved in that market. Thank you, Christopher, for an absolutely fascinating talk. And all of you who are with us, again, let me thank you for being here. We will have our last book talk of the season exactly a week from now, next Tuesday, where we will feature an up-and-coming Israeli author whose recent novel has just been translated into English. Her name is Dana Shem-Ur, Where I Am. Please join us then and for future programs, and have a great summer. Thank you again, Chris. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you.